Hey, I know you. You're that jaywalking punk anarchist.
You're that jaywalking punk anarchist. Jaywalking punk anarchist.
Hello, this is the Radical Reviewer, taking a look at A Renegade History of the United States by Thaddeus Russell. Free Press, 2010. The key idea of this text is that the greatest force for positive change in America has been the slackers, the drunks, the nonconformists, the lawbreakers, the lowlifes, in short, the renegades. Mainstream history texts focus on the heroification of the political and economic elite, and alternative texts such as A People's History of the U.S., Lies My Teacher Told Me, Democracy for the Few, focus on criticizing the hero myths of mainstream history and offering new heroes in their place, such as Daniel Che, Emma Goldman, Huey Newton, etc. A renegade history instead attempts to avoid heroification of the power elite and of the righteous radicals, and instead seeks to make heroes out of the renegades. Now, it's important to understand Russell's politics before diving into the text. He is a postmodernist libertarian, the I just want to smoke weed and open carry at a gay wedding kind of libertarian. He loves the nonconformist music, styles, colors, and cultures of alternative and minority people, and yet his anti-identity politics and pro-capitalism stance makes his views on individual freedoms ring hollow. His postmodernist view that there are no absolutes and therefore oppression is not an absolute, and his libertarian view that people's individual abilities supersede societal forces leaves him celebrating oppressed groups while denying their oppression. He has a few interviews on YouTube if you'd like to get a better idea of this, but I think as we explore the text, we'll see this in action. Let's take a look at the text in depth. Part 1. Making Renegades into Americans. The book starts by celebrating the drunks, prostitutes, pirates, race-mixing homosexuals of early lawless America, and that's a narrative I can get down with. For example, referring to the Boston Massacre, Russell states, "The Founding Fathers knew, better than our textbooks, they knew that the drunks swinging clubs and slinging horseshit at the authorities that night were a problem as much for them as for the British Empire." But Russell keeps his critique cultural. He looks at the Founding Fathers limiting personal freedoms, prostitution, sodomy, race mixing, etc., and ignores their restrictions on economic freedoms, maintaining the national debt, voting restrictions, expanding wars with the Native Americans, destroying Shays' Rebellion, etc. From here, Russell dives into celebrating the culture of slaves. He knows he's getting himself into hot water here with quotes like, "This is not an endorsement of slavery, but it is an argument that many freedoms we now cherish were available only to slaves in early America." I think this argument does more harm than good. Yes, we should celebrate the rich culture and small enjoyments slaves had in the face of the barbaric institution of slavery. But when Russell celebrates the lazy, fun-loving, dancing, sing-songy slaves and ignores and downplays their repression, he enforces the happy, contented slave narrative of the slave-owning class. For example, Russell states, "But we must come to terms with the fact that a majority of ex-slaves who offered an evaluation of slavery, field hands and house slaves, men and women, had a positive view of the institution, and many unabashedly wished to return to their slave days." Ah, yes, Russell, I'm sure. I mean, who ever heard of runaway slaves, slave revolts, or slaves killing their masters? Russell takes every negative aspect of slavery and denies it and downplays it. Work? He argues that slaves didn't work that hard, and besides, Protestant farming families worked harder than slaves. Whipping? Slaves were not whipped that much, and even if they were, whipping was a common punishment for all people back then. Rape? Rapes hardly ever happened, and even if they did, well, rapes were common back then, so no big deal. Essentially, when it comes to the horrors of slavery, Russell's arguments go as follows. It didn't happen. If it did happen, it wasn't that bad. If it was that bad, well, it was common for everyone in those days, so it wasn't a big deal. This line of argument ignores and denies repression, and so obliterates any previous celebration of the culture of the oppressed. The next chapter makes the same argument for black folks of the Reconstruction era. Russell ignores repression by the KKK and police, and when things like the Mississippi Black Codes are mentioned, they're not framed as trying to force people back into slavery through the loophole of prison labor, as the book Are Prisons Obsolete argues. Instead, Russell takes this opportunity to say, renegades are cool, and look, prominent white people said freed slaves were a bunch of lazy, thieving slobs, and that makes them renegades. Yay! If Russell wanted to make his renegade argument, it should have looked like this. Despite pressure to conform, despite lack of access to meaningful education, land, or employment, despite widespread murderous, racist repression by the Klan and other white terror groups, often with the assistance of the government, despite all this, black folks in America maintained a unique culture that celebrated and embraced a spirit of freedom and rebellion. Instead, by ignoring, downplaying, and outright denying the repression black folks faced during slavery and Reconstruction, Russell essentially says, here are a bunch of quotes of prominent figures claiming that black people are lazy and irresponsible. I'm sure that's true. Weren't they total renegades? Weren't they awesome? Russell goes from here to talk about sex workers in the Wild West, and he makes a few troubling arguments, for example, again saying that rape was rare, but for the most part, I can agree with his analysis. It's essentially the same argument made in the Adam Ruins Everything video about sex workers in the Wild West. Namely, that sex workers popularized makeup, many became wealthy landowners, many funded schools and other services for public good, and that criminalizing prostitution has caused this industry to become more dangerous and oppressive. Part 2. How white people lost their rhythm. This section essentially gives the same narrative 3 times. The Irish immigrants, the Jewish immigrants, and the Italian immigrants. Each is shown to have cultural aspects that are celebrated as renegade in nature, such as race mixing, exciting music, provocative dancing, excessive drinking, etc., etc. Then, quotes are given from various authorities saying that the people of X nationality are slackers, drunks, nonconformist renegades, and are therefore genetically similar to the inferior African Americans. Then there are examples of people from X nationality abandoning their renegade roots, denying African lineage, and conforming to the stuffy American conservative no-fun mentality. But Russell does something here that he didn't do for the chapters about black folks in part 1, namely giving some time to talk about repression and fighting back. Russell talks about Irish immigrant canal workers rioting, looting, striking, protesting, fighting for better living conditions, and fighting against the racial oppression. And he talks about Italians and blacks working together politically and religiously. But for the most part, the text remains strictly cultural, and very little mention of political and economic oppression is given. These sparse examples are hardly sufficient, and without context to the larger renegade argument Russell's making, the issue of celebrating an oppressed group while denying their oppression still remains. Part 3. Fighting for Bad Freedom. Russell looks at the spread of consumerism and organized crime from the 20s to the 50s, and the spread and promotion of alcohol, jazz, gambling, gay bars, and all that other cool renegade stuff. But then Part 3 starts to go off the rails just a bit. In the same way the book Liberal Fascism tries to make a correlation between liberalism and fascism, Russell essentially makes the same argument here, stating, the New Deal and European fascism grew from the same ideological roots, producing strikingly similar policies, and fostered national cultures that, if not identical, bore the resemblance of siblings. This section argues that both fascism and the US celebrated their leaders as cult of personalities, which is common for countries engaged in war, and both engaged in public works projects, which many countries in the Depression have done, and both looked into eugenics, which was what scientists of the day were studying. and both promoted business-friendly unionism, which most capitalist countries did in the face of the Great Depression and the Russian Revolution. Essentially, Russell's argument is the Western capitalist countries facing the Great Depression, the Russian Revolution, and entering into World War II were doing similar things, and two of these countries were called fascist. Therefore, any countries doing these actions can be called fascist. That's not to say I'm an ardent defender of FDR. I tend to agree with Chris Hedges, whose stance is that FDR and the New Deal essentially saved capitalism from worker revolution. But regardless of this, Russell's flawed reasoning remains. The last chapter of this section I don't really find problems with. It essentially argues that World War II was not as publicly supported as people believed, and that minorities didn't want to fight a war of Western powers when they were facing racial oppression at home. And also that the spread of gender-segregated military bases helped the spread of gay culture. Part 4. Which side are you on? This section starts on the Cold War with a chapter celebrating jazz, rock and roll, comics, movies, and demands for consumer goods as being the rebellious drive that led to the fall of the Soviet Union. Russell does make an interesting analysis here. He calls both the US and the USSR repressive and compares their leadership's hatred of rock and roll, and concludes, leaders of all political varieties, from the American presidents to the communist commissaries, shared a devotion to social order and are therefore natural enemies of renegades. The next chapter tackles the civil rights movement, and it really doesn't follow through on the concepts it brings up. For example, it talks about the negative side effects of Brown v. Board. For example, the white authors wanting to squash the rebellious spirit of poor black folks. But Russell doesn't talk about how desegregating schools has caused what used to be all black schools with all black staff to turn into black schools with predominantly white staff, and the various social problems that go along with that. And Russell gives the violence on both sides argument, which is an argument that can work. For example, How Nonviolence Protects the State explains that Martin Luther King Jr.'s nonviolence was only effective because mainstream white society preferred Martin Luther King's demands to those of other, more radical civil rights groups. Rather than make this argument, though, Russell simply gives several little anecdotes about black violent crime, typically with no political motives or context, and concludes, whites committed violence, but look, blacks were also violent. And this framing of the argument takes conscious agency away from the oppressed and distorts this history. The next chapter is about the gay rights movement, and essentially argues that the original gay movement tried to be as inoffensive and non-confrontational to mainstream American culture as possible, and was ineffective. But all this changed when the Stonewall riots and other fights for LGBT plus liberation celebrated parades, drag shows, flamboyance, open expressions of sexuality, and those cool renegade characteristics got results. The final chapter doesn't really feel like a conclusive end of the text. The chapter argues that both rednecks and hippies are renegades and conformists at the same time. Rednecks because they celebrate rebelliousness and yet love the US and military service. And hippies, although some may qualify as renegades, many started communes where they worked all day, essentially living like conformist Puritan farmers. And the text ends with a small anecdote of a workers' strike where the workers openly partied and openly admitted to acts of sabotage, and Russell concludes, renegades made illicit joys not only possible, but real. Conclusion. This book is a real mixed bag. Russell celebrates the culture of groups that didn't adhere to the straight, white, wealthy capitalist mainstream, while almost entirely ignoring the oppressions and repressions involved. But it is important to look at this text for a view on what consists of a postmodernist libertarian interpretation of U.S. history, especially as Russell is working on a renegade history of U.S. foreign policy, which I'm sure will be well worth the read for similar reasons. Libertarian Russell gives no class analysis, and perhaps to keep the text light, he doesn't go into the details of the brutality of oppression. And this has left us with a text that can fun-lovingly celebrate the race mixing of early America, the music, dancing, and sexual liberation of slaves, the sex workers of the Old West, the jazz and disco and rock and roll playing immigrant musicians, and the mob-ran gay bars of Prohibition. And yet, Russell fails to talk meaningfully about the brutal repression these oppressed groups faced. Russell gives us quotes from prominent figures calling these oppressed groups buffoons and slackers, and with no critique of oppression, these claims remained unchallenged. And so we're left with a history of renegades who are devoid of agency and incapable or uninterested in actively challenging the status quo. In short, we're left with a history that both celebrates and insults the renegades. If you're interested in radical theory, looking for a book recommendation or whatever, you can get your radical book reviews here with the Radical Reviewer. Thanks for watching.